Yeah, well, I came in actually later than Phil and everybody else. I was the last man of the party, basically. And you know, I came in here one day, and Lee Hines and Keith Tanaka and Paul Sterrett were over in the corner, and I just wandered in here off the street, basically, with my brother, and then out of nowhere, I see Lee Hines, and Lee Hines spotted me, and Lee Hines goes, "My God, it's Mill, it's you. I haven't seen you in 40 friggin' years." And you know, Keith,
He recognized you.
Lee Hines
After all those
recognized me
years?
after all these years, and then they introduced me to Paul Sterrett, and that's how I got back into it. And then I met the famous Philippe de L'Espinay, and I had been around in the '60s, and I was one of the first people to join the USRA. I was at the second meeting at Don's Raceway, and I was an original member of the Car Model Racing Association, the CMRA, which preceded that. And I never met Phil back in the '60s, but I met Brian and Tori and everybody else. And Phil was a great local racer in his area, and he grew up in the same area as Brian.
Well, see, I never got to race with Brian and John, and I mean, I raced at just a little local track by my house where I could ride my bicycle, and John and Brian were gone to the races, and the only time I'd see them usually was around school, and then later on we kind of hung out. We were more into drinking beer than racing slot cars, but I mean, I just raced at the local tracks. So one of the tracks I raced at was Daytona Raceway, which was right over across from Brian's house, and but he was usually out of town. Him and John were out of town, racing. No,
I never raced with Phil back in the day. I raced with Brian. I raced with Tori. I mainly raced with Mike Stubbe and Terry Schmidt. Knew them real well. I started racing at Charlie's Raceway in Downey, and then when Charlie's went out of business, Don's Raceway opened right on the main drag on Downey Avenue, and that was the big place for us to go, was Don's Raceway. I used to ride my bike with my box that I have today, and it's strapped to the back of my 10-speed, and drive down to the track and spend the whole day, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, I used to put my Hoffman box on my handlebars of my Schwinn, Made in America Schwinn, back then, and just ride it over to the slot car track. And
yeah, I continued racing. In fact, Don's Raceway up until the day Don closed, and that's when I got out of racing. But I mean, we held ARCO races there. I can still remember Pete Zimmerman sleeping under the King track. And one of the funny stories is at Don's Raceway, we had an original American Blue King that had the bump in the straightaway, and Terry Schmidt was turn marshaling the bump there. So he's at the end of the bank. A car flew up and hit Terry in the forehead, and Terry went back like this, and it was literally almost knocked out. And from that point on, at Don's, we put up a big checkered flag that hung behind the bank, so when cars shot off into it, they'd slide down, and the turn marshal would then pull it out of the flag and then put the car back on. But it almost killed poor Terry.
The fact that Paul Sterrett and Philippe and Dennis Sampson and Mike Stubbe, of course, started the D3.
Yeah.
And
you can't say good enough things about them.
And look where it's gone.
Mike Stubbe created the jail door class. I mean, Paul Sterrett has kept everything going. Dennis Sampson and Philippe. I mean, these guys have really done a job to keep slot racing alive. And without that, there would be no slot racing. There isn't slot racing within 90, 100 miles, basically, of Buena Park days. And just the cars. I mean, today we can afford, more than we could. And now you see, people to this day, Stubbe and Terry and everything. Now that we have the equipment, Phil's been top qualifier so many times here and winning because of the fact now he can afford it. He's got the same.
All I got to do now is win.
Field.
Now I got to win the race.
Now you got to win the race.
One hot lap doesn't cut it. But you know what? The bottom line is even if you have the money, even if you have all the money to buy whatever equipment you want,
still got to drive it.
That's not going to buy you a win,
You still got to drive it, and you know, I think that's one of the things that surprised everybody coming back, is that Brian's better now than he ever was. Phil is too, and you know, I think quite honestly, like you see Terry Schmidt, he's getting back into it and getting the hang of it. But you know, in his day, these guys, Terry, Mike, and those guys were unbeatable. But now. They're finding, you know, 40 years later, if you've got equal equipment, we'll run you for it, you know.
Well, I think, too, all the equipment is so much better that you can buy now over the counter. Back then, those guys, I mean, things were changing so fast because they were constantly building chassis. You know, you'd read in the Scale Racing News, I'd look in there and go, and look at all the different pictures of the chassis and go, oh, there's Sucrus, he's a real famous guy. There's his chassis, you know, and there's Pete Zimmerman, and of course Brian and John and a lot of other guys, Terry, and so I'd look at those and I'd try to copy that. Well, you know, I could try to copy it, but you know, it didn't really work because they had all the latest, best, you know, tires and all that sort of thing, and so it's
and nobody had the information. Nobody shared anything. Today, you can look on the slot blog and you can see what Keith Tanaka posts, and you can see immediately. In those days, nobody would even tell you what gears they were running, let alone take a look and see how to build a chassis or something.